Our first presenter of the day is no stranger to anyone who's been to a CURT national conference for any number of years. Anirban Basu is not only extremely informative, but insightful, accurate, and entertaining. And we're glad that he is back today. Anirban is chairman and CEO of the SAGE Policy Group. It's an economic and policy consulting firm in Baltimore, Maryland, home of those Ravens that the Bengals snatched the win from I just had to mention that, Anirban, I'm so sorry. Actually, we did not win that game, Anirban. They gave it to us, and thankfully we had a runner who was there at the right moment. But anyway, Anirban has received his Master's of Public Policy from Harvard. He's got a degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown. He's got a Master's in Mathematical Economics from the University of Maryland. Other accolades, they're in your bio. But at this time, will you please join me in welcoming our good friend to the stage, Mr. Anirban Basu.
Righto, can you hear me? We have a considerable amount of time to talk about the economy, as it turns out, 90 minutes. There's, I think, supposed to be a remote up here somewhere. Oh, it's right behind me. Oh, thanks. And I won't be speaking for the entire 90 minutes, of course, but about 60 minutes of speaking, 30 minutes of Q&A. So please think about what questions you'd like to ask me as I go through my material. Please put up the slides. Yeah, there they are. So my presentation today is entitled Show Me the Money Supply. This is a Tom Cruise themed presentation. You'll see that theming throughout the presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it's firmly baked within the cake. See lots of references to Tom Cruise, who is often said to be the last of the great Hollywood actors. In any case, or stars. So why would I start a presentation by talking about money supply? Why would one build that into the title? Well, of course, that's the issue of the day. The availability of money, the cost of money, meaning interest rate, the cost of capital generally. This is money supply graph back to 1959. Now, much of the data I will show you this morning are time series data, so the more contemporary data to the right of the slide. You will note that profound growth in money supply to countervail the worst impacts of the pandemic on the economy, 2020, 2021, into 2022. What is that associated with? Well, of course, when something is more available, it's less expensive, meaning the cost of capital plummeted. And this had everything to do with the Federal Reserve's efforts to reduce interest rates through expanding their balance sheet, of course, reducing the Fed funds rate and other benchmark rates, of which we'll speak today. But you will note that money supply is no longer increasing. This is M2 parenthetically. That, in fact, now money supply is diminishing. That money has become more expensive, less available. We'll talk about this, and of course the effect on construction and construction users throughout the presentation. And when money is disappearing, I think you understand what are the implications of that. And that's exactly right, risky business. And so we want to talk about that. And what is the culprit here? The culprit here, of course, is that we stimulated a very strong economic rebound from the worst stage of the pandemic. By the second quarter of 2021, U.S. gross domestic product is above its pre-pandemic tally. That's how quickly we recovered. Combination of monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus. But with that rapid recovery came a bout of enduring inflation. And so now, instead of trying to stimulate economic growth, policymakers are trying to, or at least certain policymakers, slow down economic growth in an effort to slow down inflation. And that is, of course, the culprit. This is your U.S. Consumer Price Index. 12-month percentage change, again, time series data, so the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. Two lines here. The line in green that ends at the top, that's your overall consumer price index. And what it says is that between December of 2021 and December of 2022, overall inflation running at 6.5%. The Federal Reserve's target, as you know, is 2% inflation. It is akin to a neighborhood with a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit. But cars were going through that neighborhood at 90 miles per hour. For in June of 2022, inflation was sitting at 9% on a year-over-year basis. So some of that peak inflation is behind us. That's true. We seem to have achieved peak inflation. Nonetheless, at 9% inflation, the Federal Reserve had made the decision we need to do more. We need to raise interest rates. We need to tighten monetary policy. We need to throw deer in front of those cars to try to slow them down. And now we're doing 65 miles per hour through that neighborhood. Still too fast is the point. Now, it looks a bit better when you look at other measures of inflation. One is here. The line that ends at the bottom in gold, that's your core inflation rate, all items less food and energy. So when you strip out egg prices and propane prices and other prices like that, non-core prices, you get down to 5.7%, but still meaningfully above that 2% target. And of course, inflation has many implications, many of them negative as it turns out, not all of them. We can talk about that as well. The amount of inflation since May of 2020 has been quite profound. So if you were to compare the US Consumer Price Index as of May of 2020, why that month? That's the first month of the economic recovery. Inflation is actually quite mild during that period, but I started with that period because it's a significant month. To December of 2022, which is the last month for which we have CPI data, if you look toward the bottom here, overall inflation, the all items CPI, at 15.8% in roughly 2.5 years. The core CPI at roughly 13% in 2.5 years. Obviously, we've missed that 2% target. Now, I can show you things categorically as well. That's the green horizontal line. So energy prices up 50% over that period. Used car and truck prices up 36.5%. Transportation service prices up 25%. New car prices up 20%. So in any case, lots of inflation, and this has many implications, including hammering the household balance sheet. And we'll talk a lot about consumer spending today as well, a driver of economic expansion or recovery thus far. Now, you might say, Anirban, wait up. Isn't it true you just said we'd achieve peak inflation? Isn't it true that inflation is slowing? Yes, that's true. That if you were to look at the last year of data, December of 2021 versus December of 2022, the inflation numbers don't look nearly as problematic. Again, you can see those headline numbers toward the bottom of the slide, 6.5% on the overall inflation rate, 5.7% on the core. But still, you have some fairly significant price increases in some of these segments. So transportation service prices up nearly 15%. That includes things like airfares. Food prices up 10.4%. That includes eggs, the prices of which are up 60% over the past year. I gave a presentation or delivered a presentation earlier this week at the University of Delaware, and their team name, their mascot name is the Blue Hens. And I pointed out to them that egg prices had risen significantly. They had known this, and I said, you Blue Hens need to be raising some chickens. They didn't enjoy that joke either. So, shelter up 7.5%. That includes apartment rent, so on and so forth. So still lots of inflation. And so the Federal Reserve still has some work to do. That's what this week has been all about in the markets, whether it's with respect to Jerome Powell's speech or interviews or so on and so forth. Neil Kashkari, who's the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, his statements that he's made recently, other Federal Reserve presidents. What will the Federal Reserve do? How close are they to that terminal Fed funds rate? Well, let's talk about what the Federal Reserve might be thinking about. Because inflation causes some pain. So here, I won't go through all of this slide, just hit the key bullet points here. So of course, when inflation is high, there's less purchasing power. That's true not just for households, but also for businesses, obviously. But of course, when inflation is high, that also reduces the savings rate. If people are spending more on their rent and food and so on and so forth, they can save less money. Indeed, the US savings rate has been falling sharply in recent months, and you've probably heard the stories about Americans amassing significant credit card debt in the process. So there's that. It hammers the consumer sector, and of course, the stimulus payments are behind us now. So we get close to that point when many consumers are facing exhaustion financially. It, of course, raises borrowing costs, which for construction users is a major issue. My sense is that at least a fair share of the construction you finance is financed through debt. Of course, inflation raises interest rates generally as a general proposition, but here's a biggie, this last one. It disproportionately hurts the poor. So, people of means, yes, inflation hurts them too, of course, but they often have a savings buffer that's larger than others. They have financial advisors who can tell them, don't worry about it, just invest in a one-year treasury. It's yielding 4.84% today. It'll hold you steady. Risk-free, you'll get your principal back in a year with certainty. But many people, let's say the lowest quintiles of income, they don't have a financial advisor, and they're the ones, of course, who get whopped when egg prices take off, bread prices, milk prices, gasoline prices, so on and so forth. And this Federal Reserve, and this is why I bring it up, I'm not trying to make a social statement, I'm trying to predict Federal Reserve behavior. This Federal Reserve, I think, views itself as having a social mission. And you can sort of see that when you look at their behavior as a policymaking body in 2021. It's in the spring of 2021 that this bout of enduring inflation begins to spring up. By the summer of 2021, inflation is running at above 5%. Now, typically you would expect a Federal Reserve under those circumstances to start tightening monetary policy, raising interest rates. They don't do that. They don't start raising interest rates until about a year later, March of 2022. And my theory is that one of the reasons is they understood full well that the people who were most dislocated by the pandemic were people who worked in retail, restaurants, leisure and hospitality, meaning hotels, often entry-level, lower-wage jobs, most deeply affected by economic lockdowns. And they want to get those people back to work. And so inflation begins to manifest itself during the spring, or excess inflation in the spring of 2021. They take the attitude, don't worry about it, it's transitory. I think they really wanted to get people back to work. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but other Federal Reserves would not have done that. They would have said, we got to hammer this inflation. I think this group really has a social mission. I'm not saying that's good or bad, that's for you to decide, but since inflation disproportionately impacts the poor, my thinking is they're going to tighten for a lengthier period than many people in the market believe and keep interest rates higher than many people believe. Now, you might say, well, I don't understand that, Anirban. If you slow down economic growth, don't you hurt the labor market? Doesn't it make it more difficult for those folks to actually keep jobs or find jobs? That's true. But a lot of people out of the labor market already, for reasons, for instance, of age, they're just hit by inflation. They have no way to recoup that. So, for instance, in our country, about 13% of people over the age of 80 live in poverty, as an example. I think this Federal Reserve is really quite keen on bringing inflation down, in part because it disproportionately impacts the poor, including the elderly poor. And so what have they been doing since, sort of that period of idleness in 2021 as inflation blossomed? Well, of course, they've changed course. Starting in March of 2022, as I say, they started to increase interest rates. This is their key policy tool, their key policy mechanism, the Fed funds rate, the overnight bank lending rate. And you can see how profound the increase in the Fed funds rate is. You all know this. But since March of 2022, they've raised the Fed funds rate 18 times in terms of quarter-point equivalents. So coming into this period, the Fed funds rate upper limit, which is what I'm grabbing for you here, is 0.25%. It's now 4.75%. And more increases are coming. What are they trying to do, of course? What are they trying to accomplish? They're trying to engineer a soft landing. We all know what that is. They want to slow economic growth down by making money more expensive, more scarce. Take excess inflation out of the economy through the process of bringing demand into conformity with supply without driving us into recession. That's the goal. And the question then becomes, is that possible or is that mission impossible? Well, I will say this. As of this moment, we do not appear to be in recession. The U.S. economy continues to manifest momentum. Now, one of the reasons for that might be that monetary policy lags. If you increase interest rates today, it doesn't necessarily translate into economic impact today. The full impact of interest rate increases won't show up for many, many months. According to Raphael Bostic, who is president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve, very influential person in monetary policy circles, though he's currently not a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee. But, quote, a large body of research tells us it can take 18 months to 2 years or more for tighter monetary policy to materially affect inflation. Now, so well, Anirban, it didn't take that long. Inflation's already been coming down. Here's the thing. I think the easier part of reducing inflation off that peak is behind us. Why? Because back in early 2021, as inflation is rearing its ugly head, or excess inflation, a lot of that was due to supply chain issues. And that's one of the other reasons I think the Federal Reserve thought it was transitory. The notion was supply is going to catch up as we come out of these economic lockdowns. We will see prices return, or price growth return back to 2%. No problem, it's transitory. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. Now, there are still supply chain issues out there, as we know. I was speaking to a group of HVAC contractors recently, and they said to me that their lead time for switchgear, for electrical equipment, was around 2 years in many instances. So you still have that, and we can come back to that. But by and large, the supply chain issues appear to be at their worst across all product segments during the, or many product segments, I guess, during late 2021. Has been improving steadily there, since that time. But as we're going to get into, the stickier part of inflation is still left to handle. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. In any case, 18 months to 2 years. So there's a big lag effect. So they started increasing rates in March of 2022. 18 months out from that gets you to September of this year. 2 years gets you out, of course, to March of 2024. So still lots of effect from these interest rate increases to come. Many reasons for the lag. I won't go through all this, but people sign long-term contracts, they're in labor agreements, or they have 1 year or 2 year rental agreements, so on and so forth. In the meantime, higher rates reduce investment, slow hiring and wage growth, and eventually increase unemployment, though, as we know, that hasn't happened yet. Doesn't mean it won't happen, again, because of that lag effect. Now, here's what the Federal Reserve Chairman has to say about these things. So back in August of 2022, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says the following, quote, while higher interest rates, slower growth, and softer labor market conditions will bring down inflation, they'll also bring some pain to households and businesses. These are the unfortunate costs of reducing inflation, but a failure to restore price stability would mean far greater pain. Okay, that's August. And we'll come back to this notion of pain later on in the presentation. In November, so just about 3 months ago, our Federal Reserve Chairman says the following, let me say this, it is very premature to be thinking about pausing, meaning pausing our rate hikes, just 3 months ago. It is very premature. So people, when they hear lags, they think about a pause. What does that mean? Well, exactly what Raphael Bostic was talking about. Many people would say to the Federal Reserve, you've done so much. You've raised interest rates so dramatically. We've not seen anything like this in our lifetime. Let the medicine take its course. Let it work. Let it slow down the economy. Let it bring excess inflation out of the economy. Don't do any more. Pause. You know, one of the things you're taught in economics or business school or wherever is don't fight the Fed. Don't fight the Fed. I think the new mantra out there is now don't believe the Fed. Because the Fed is saying we're still going to tighten. We're going to keep interest rates high and rising for a considerable period of time, but the market says, no, you're going to pivot. You're going to pivot. You're going to give up. You're worried about increasing unemployment, so on and so on. You don't have the commitment to this endeavor, this enterprise. But then during this third sentence, Jerome Powell goes on to say, it's very premature. So in the span of 3 sentences, Jerome Powell says the words very premature twice. Not especially eloquent, but it makes the point. It's very premature, in my view, to think about or to be talking about pausing our rate hike. That's just 3 months ago. Of course, they raised rates very recently, February 1st. And more rate hikes to come, March, May. And then the question becomes, will they continue to raise into June? That'll be one of the questions you'll hear on Bloomberg and CNBC and so on and so forth, all these pundits. But the notion is 0.25% during the next couple of meetings. But notice, we haven't seen the full effect of all the interest rate increases that have transpired thus far. Now again, to date, the U.S. economy seems to be plowing through. The broadest measure of U.S. economic progress is gross domestic product, or growth thereof. This is quarterly data, annualized rates of growth. You can see the recovery begins during the third quarter, roughly the third quarter of 2020, when the U.S. economy surges 35.3% on an annualized basis. During several ensuing quarters, high single-digit rates of growth. Again, by the second quarter of 2021, we're back in terms of gross domestic product. True. During the first half of 2022, we suffered 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, satisfying a technical definition of recession, but then bounced back with a 3.2% performance in the third quarter, the 2.9% performance to finish off last year. The Atlanta Federal Reserve maintains a product called GDP Now, which forecasts current quarter gross domestic product, and their most recent forecast, which is just a day old, 2.1% growth during the current quarter. So not recession. We have not achieved recession. Indeed, some parts of the economy, if anything, have been strengthening recently, which I have to admit has become a surprise to me. And this is the biggest surprise. It may have surprised many of you. This is monthly jobs. Monthly job change in America, graph back to May of 2020 when the recovery begins. But look at the last reading. You probably heard about this. January of 2023, America adds 517,000 net new jobs, roughly treble the consensus estimate. That's not recession. And of course, as these Americans find their way into new employment, that continues to fuel consumer spending. That's not recessionary. And I have to admit, thus far, the Federal Reserve has been pretty successful, at least since they've started to combat inflation. They've brought inflation off of its peak, or at least watch it come off of its peak, without driving us to recession. So far, so good. Pretty impressive. And if anything, employers are set to hire even more people going forward. Why would one conclude that? Because based on the JOLT survey, America is home to 11 million available unfilled jobs. There are almost precisely 2 job openings for every unemployed American. America is still very much the land of opportunity. If you want a job in America, there is one waiting for you. Actually, there are 2. There are 413,000 available unfilled construction jobs in this country, near an all-time high. The all-time high was 440,000 in April of 2022. We're right there. But since April of 2022, of course, the cost of capital has increased massively, but we have not seen any material alteration in the number of available construction job openings. That's remarkable. Before the pandemic struck down the economy, before it undid the economy, when the economy was very strong, we had that 3.5% rate of unemployment, which at that time was a 50-year low. We had 7 million job openings in this economy. Now 11 million available unfilled jobs. So employers are scrambling, as you know, to find human capital. As often is the case, the problem here, the difficulty people suffer filling available jobs, the problem here is men. And some people might say, especially the women in the audience, that, well, in general, men are the problem. But I'm speaking strictly about the labor force, just that. I'm limiting it to that. This is a change in labor force participation rates by age and gender, 1980 versus 2023. 1980 versus 2023. So if you look at the line in the bold, toward the top of the sort of numeric elements here, that's the labor force. Labor force participation rate between 1980 and 2023 fell 1.4%, but fell 9.6% for men in percentage point terms, while rising 5.5% for women. Men have become less engaged. Now, you can break this down by age. So you see the first age bracket, 16 to 19 years, negative 19.5% labor force participation, but we understand why that's the case. People are going to college more since 1980, right? The mantra has become 4-year college degree, be in college, be in college. And also, school systems around the country have worked very hard to limit high school dropouts. So that makes sense that you would have that. For 20 and 24-year-olds, something similar, negative 5.0% total, but negative 14.1% for men, plus 2.2% for women. But again, you could make the case, well, maybe these men are in college. And of course, many men take 6, 7, 8 years to get through college. And so, not surprising that you would have, this affect people up to the age of 24. But then how do you explain 25 to 34-year-olds, plus 3.3% total labor force participation rate change in percentage point terms, but negative 6.6% for men, plus 12.5% for women? What are these young men up to? No one really knows because everyone's too scared to ask. But my very strong sense is they're up to no good. They're out there right now doing nothing. Oh, they're watching ESPN. They watch SportsCenter 3 or 4 times in the morning. They do some fantasy football, perhaps. Then they watch ESPN at night. And they surf from couch to couch. Maybe they're smoking some weed. I don't know, but they're not working. And if they are smoking weed, I don't want them on a construction job, by the way. And for a male-dominated industry like construction, which is 87% male, manufacturing, by the way, is 70% male, these industries have the greatest difficulty recruiting because young American men are not particularly engaged. I actually think there's a crisis of young American maledom in this country. Now, sometimes when I say this during presentations, actually young men will come up to me afterwards and say, no, there isn't. And I will say, you are evidence that there is. I think that they are disengaged. The women are killing it. And it is often said that men make more than women, which is true. But young men do not make more than young women. And the gap between the genders is going to increase over time because women are dominating men in terms of education attainment. And we're soon going to be in a country where the number of female college graduates, the recent number of recent college graduates, outnumbers male college graduates 2 to 1. So that's where we are. And so no wonder that in the economy, there's so much difficulty hiring enough workers. And one of the other things, of course, that's happened to shrink the labor force and labor force participation is the early retirement of many baby boomers. And I'm amazed, and perhaps you've been amazed too, that so many of my friends in their mid-50s, late 50s are saying, I'm hanging it up. I'm retiring. You know, some people, you know, like Tom Brady don't seem to be able to retire, but other people are saying that's enough for me. I'm done. And it should be noted that these employers are collectively trying to hire, even though we've achieved record levels of employment in this country. If you were to compare February of 2020 employment, why that month, that's the last month before we shut down the economy, against January of 2023, the last month for which we have data, America's up 2.7 million jobs. We've added 1.8% to our pre-pandemic employment tally. These green horizontal bars represent the number of jobs added or subtracted by each of these segments over this roughly 3-year period. At the top of the heap is professional business services. That's your accounting firm, your law firms, white-collar jobs often are in that category, though many are in some other segments like finance and so on and so forth. But it's a very large part of the economy, which helps explain part of its primacy, but disproportionately, this segment offers the opportunity for people to work remotely. And that's what many people want. And of course, construction as a general proposition does not offer the opportunity for people to work remotely. Design work maybe, architects, so on and so forth, but not people who actually deliver construction services at a job site. Can't work remotely, can't do that. Many people prefer to work remotely because they don't want to commute. They don't want to be with their colleagues. They do not like their colleagues. A survey finds that 57% of Americans find their colleagues to be annoying because they overshare, meaning I asked you what you did this weekend, I didn't intend for you to answer. You take credit for my work, but the number one reason people find their colleagues to be annoying, they interrupt during meetings, which can happen on Zoom. Nonetheless, there's this general preference for remote work. 68% of Americans indicated, according to a recent survey, that they prefer remote work to working at a job site. They want that flexibility. And for some industries like professional business services, that's an advantage in recruiting. Conversely, leisure and hospitality, which is your hotel and restaurant workers by and large, it's the lowest wage segment of the economy. And as a general proposition, they don't offer the opportunity to work remotely. And so that segment, though people are in those segments are racing to hire more workers, lots of job openings in those categories, they're often outcompeted for human capital, and so this result prevails. I gave a speech recently, or a presentation in Traverse City, Michigan, which is a perfectly lovely place. And as I was leaving town, I drove past Taco Bell. And of course, the Taco Bell said help wanted, they all do. But next to that sign was a sign that said, we pay daily. And so employers are pulling out all the stops to try to retain and recruit human capital. That's where we are right now. That, of course, is inflationary. And of course, there's more inflation in certain parts of the country than others because some parts of the country have recovered much faster than others. This is employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. Percentage terms, February of 2020 versus December of 2022, as the subnational data are not yet available for January. Now, you'll note that in the first column, among the faster growing markets, that's the American South. That's where the population is increasing. That's where the jobs have been growing. Dallas, Riverside, California, which received a lot of population infusion from Los Angeles, much more expensive area. Tampa, Charlotte, Atlanta, Phoenix, Houston, San Antonio, all southern markets. That's where the energy has been. But here's the problem. Some of these markets are still growing. There's still demand for workers, but my guess is in-migration to these areas is going to slow compared to what it has been. Why is that? One, these areas are getting more expensive. So the cost advantage between a Tampa, Florida, for instance, and a Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that's closing because Tampa's become more expensive more quickly. Philadelphia's still more expensive, don't get me wrong, but that cost gap is closing. That's one. Second, if I'm sitting on a 30-year fixed mortgage rate at 2.5%, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not moving anywhere and then getting a 30-year fixed mortgage rate at 6%, let's say. I'm stuck. And so some of these workforce shortages actually might get more challenging during the months ahead because of slowed migration from region to region to region. The Northeast corridor is in the right-hand column. Slower economic growth. Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, so on and so forth. You can see at the very bottom a very expensive metropolitan area. The Washington metropolitan area at number 24 is San Francisco, also very expensive. One of the things that we saw during the pandemic is a lot of out-migration from more expensive, densely populated communities to less populated, less densely populated, less expensive areas. So again, people moving from San Francisco to Sacramento, or to Boise, Idaho, or Reno, Nevada, or so on and so forth, or LA to Phoenix. We saw a lot of that. Now, this next slide, much more important, even though it's the same 25 major metropolitan areas, this is unemployment rates for those regions, December of 2022. And here's the fundamental challenge, ladies and gentlemen. These unemployment rates are far too low. They say, Anirban, that's crazy talk. We're happy to have you back at CURT for another year, fine, but this is your last year. Because you're insane. We love low rates of unemployment, Anirban. Low unemployment is a good thing. I would agree. As a general proposition, that's true, that we like it when people graduate from apprenticeship programs or high school or college can quickly find opportunity, or when they lose a job, let's say through no fault of their own, can quickly find replacement opportunity. Yes, we as a general proposition love that, but not when you have 11 million available unfilled jobs and you're still struggling to bring inflation back down to its 2% target. Because the Federal Reserve looks at these data and says, I can't live with this. Miami at 1.9%, how do you grow an economy without triggering excess inflation when there's almost no one left to hire? You never get to 0%. You can't get to 0% unemployment because job search takes time. To be unemployed, you have to be looking for work, but job search takes time under the best of circumstances. Graduate from high school, college, apprenticeship program. Somebody stabs their boss in the eye. They're looking for a job. So that kind of thing, you never get to 0. But pretty close. I mean, the highest unemployment rate here is Chicago Metro at 4.2%. That's low. And again, what do we see? There are 11 million available unfilled jobs still yet to fill. So that's inflationary. That's why I say we've got this sticky inflation problem. The easier part of reducing inflation off that peak in June of 2022 is behind us. The harder work's in front of us. And so when the Federal Reserve chairman in August of 2022 says, I'm going to cause some pain to households, that's what he's talking about. Someone's going to have to lose their job. I cannot live with this equilibrium. Which is why I think the Federal Reserve might be more aggressive in tightening than many other market participants. I could be wrong, and we'll talk more about that, possibility of me being wrong. But setting that aside for now, I think you can understand the problem. And so as the Federal Reserve continues to keep monetary policy tightened, in fact, continues to tighten it, what does that create, of course? Well, possibility of recession. Jerry Maguire, 1996, I cried. I cried a lot. Now, let's first define recession before we actually talk about its probability. So I mentioned that during the first half of 2022, we sustained those 2 negative quarters of GDP growth, which again satisfies a technical definition of recession, and in fact in many countries is the definition of recession, but not in America. In America, it's different. The National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee is the official recession scorekeeper. They're the official arbiter of whether or not we have been in recession, are in one, so on and so forth, when it ended. It maintains a chronology of US business cycles. So as an example, they sit in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they're the ones who made the determination that in 2001, that recession began in March of 2001 and ended in November of 2001. Actually, they probably made that declaration in 2002, but the point is about 2001. NBER's traditional definition of recession is a, quote, significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and that lasts more than a few months. Except that in 2020, they declared a recession. They said it began in February of 2020 and ended in April of 2020. That's not more than a few months, but they declared it a recession nonetheless because they can do that. Why? Because there is no fixed rule about which indicators contribute information to the process or how they're weighted in the determination of recession. They make it up as they go. And it is conceivable that they will not declare a recession, in the near term, let's say over the next 1 to 2 years. But other economists will say, well, there was a recession, but They're the official arbiters. And because the government statistics NBER's committee relies upon are at various or published at various lags, they cannot officially designate a recession until after it starts and often not until it's over, which will be another source potentially of debate. So in any case, that's the definition of recession, and that's why a recession was not declared for early 2022, because they didn't see it as a recession. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, I'm just saying that's what happened. Now, there are some leading indicators out there suggesting that economic weakness is expanding, despite that blockbuster January jobs report. As an example, this is the S&P 500, and some of you will point out to me the obvious, which is through the first part of this year, the S&P 500 has been rallying along with other domestic equity markets or indices. But last year, the S&P was down 19%. The Dow was off 10%. The NASDAQ was off 30%. Bitcoin was off 65%. Asset prices generally deflated. What is the value of stock? It's the discounted value of future corporate earnings divided by the number of shares outstanding. If one thinks that the economy is going to get worse, that's bad for corporate earnings, and so tomorrow's weakness will show up in stock prices today. If you look at the longer-term picture here, we'll roll off the S&P peak achieved several months ago. And so there's that. There's more, however, in terms of indications of spreading economic weakness. I mentioned consumer spending as a driver of economic recovery and expansion. This is U.S. retail sales. And for each of the past 2 months, retail sales have declined, meaningfully, more than 1 percentage point on a per-month basis. The consumer seems to be facing some significant exhaustion. Some of you might follow the import data. Imports brought by ship to the United States, the forecast was just downgraded because retailers are ordering less merchandise because they're saying fewer sales. And they don't want their inventories to bulk up even further. So, to date, the consumer has stared inflation right in the eyes and spent right through it. And I'll give you an example. During a recent 12-month period, not the last 12 months, but during a recent 12-month period, airfares in this country rose 43%. Now, I've been speaking on behalf of Kurt for several years now. I've come to know many of you. I don't know all of you, of course. And some of you might be here for the first time. But as a general proposition, I know who you are. You are highly successful people. That's why you're here. You've achieved something meaningful in your career. You're leaders within your organizations. You make important decisions. And so when you board an airplane, you are aisle and window people. That's who you are. You are aisle and window people, the finest America has to offer. And when you board an airplane in that aisle or window seat, you're praying for one thing, or if you're an atheist, hoping for one thing. And it's not even the safety of the flight. That's secondary. You just want one thing, and you know what that is. I know what that is. You just want that middle seat empty. And that does not make you a bad person, doesn't make you a good person, but doesn't make you a bad person. But to date, despite this massive increase in airfares, that middle seat has been full, much to your chagrin and frustration. But now the consumer is starting to see, hey, I'm taking on more credit card debt here, I'm having more difficulty paying for food and rent and so on and so forth, and so you're starting to see that spreading weakness. And the consumer, of course, is 2/3 of aggregate demand. You can't have a recession without the consumer's participation. But the consumer is starting to get a little frayed at the edges. Here's another thing. Because many employers have not been able to find enough workers to staff up fully, they've been turning to technology and equipment as force multipliers to try to bulk up productivity and output. But during the fourth quarter of 2022, this comes from the US GDP data, this is non-residential fixed investment in equipment. Equipment purchases actually fell. And you can't blame supply chain for that, not anymore. That's because many businesses are trying to pull back. We'll talk more about this. Indeed, at the firm level, we've seen some emerging issues. And we'll see what happens with Bed Bath & Beyond and so on and so forth. But facing economic headwinds, many large companies have missed earnings estimates recently, though admittedly many companies actually exceeded their earnings estimate. And in the aggregate, perhaps during the fourth quarter of 2022, earnings were a bit better than anticipated. That's true. Nonetheless, many large companies have missed them. According to a November 2022 PwC survey of U.S. executives, 26% of firms are planning to reduce the number of full-time employees over the next 12 to 18 months. And what seems to have happened is that many, at least large company CEOs, have changed their perspective on things. During much of this pandemic recovery period, the notion has been, I got to chase demand. The economy is recovering very, very quickly, domestically and internationally. I've got to bulk up my capacity. I've got to produce more to meet that unmet demand. Now the notion is demand is fading. And for me to keep my quarterly earnings high, it's not about chasing demand, increasing my footprint. It's about me cutting some costs. In August of 2022, 50% of firms said they already had or had a plan in place to reduce overall headcount. It's coming. The plans are in place. 4 out of 5 executives surveyed by PwC in November of 2022, so just 3 months ago, said a recession is coming within the next 6 months. Now, they're probably wrong about that, or were, but the mentality has changed. It's shifted from one of let's pursue growth to let's pursue profitability through more efficiency. During his most recent earnings announcement or call, Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, also / Facebook, said the word efficient or efficiency 41 times. And you see, some noteworthy layoffs, particularly in technology segments, since May of 2022. Again, the mentality has changed. In fact, Meta is here. Workforce before layoffs, 87,314. They've announced 11,000 layoffs, 13% of their global workforce. PayPal, Alphabet, Spotify. Earlier this week, we had Dell Computers, announced 6,650 layoffs. So it's coming, it's spreading. Now, you announce a layoff today, it doesn't mean job loss today, because there's a severance period. So a very prominent technology firm just announced 12,000 layoffs, but indicated that they would not start until April. That kind of thing. So yes, the January jobs report was fabulous. By the way, many economists will tell you, don't believe those numbers. They'll point to things like a very mild winter, some California state government employees coming back to work off of strike, seasonal adjustments, just pure statistics. I try not to ignore the data. If you start ignoring pieces of data, what happens is you only pay attention to the data that agree with your perspective. So I try not to do that. Nonetheless, there are some reasons to question how strong that January jobs report really was. Setting that aside, you can see the mentality has changed here. And what does this mean for real estate and construction, segments of great interest here today? Well, let's talk about that. This is Tom Cruise, 1992 movie, playing the part of Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee. In any case, he is good looking, gotta say that. I started this presentation by talking about interest rates. It's the right place to begin a presentation because this is a central bank dominated, oriented global economy. Those are the enterprises or institutions that are making the waves and shaping economic outcomes around the world, including the United States. And again, the goal has been to try to reduce inflation, whether in Argentina, the United States, or elsewhere. Here are 2 interest rates of interest, the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in green, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in gold, the color of money. Now, back in January of 2022, according to Freddie Mac, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate was 3.22%. More recently, it's been around 6%. Now, some of you will say, Anirban, a 6% 30-year fixed mortgage rate is not a big deal. My first mortgage was 18%. My first mortgage was 15%. And people say that as if they're bragging about it. I don't know why. It's an interesting history, however. But to the millennials and to Generation Z, the youngest members of our workforce, the oldest of that group will turn 26 this year, according to a conventional definition of that generation. 6% seems high. High enough that has prompted many to exit the home purchasing market. Unless you're a private equity firm, home purchasing often begins with a mortgage application. That's where it begins for most Americans, a mortgage application. Well, mortgage applications have collapsed. This is from the Mortgage Bankers Association. This is U.S. Mortgage Loan Applications Composite Index, which over the past year is down 60%. This includes refinances. About 80% of home improvement, major home improvement projects, are financed through a cash-out refinance. So this is big for the home improvement market, as it turns out. But this also includes purchase money mortgage. The appetite for home ownership has dimmed. This is a housing market that was frothy through March and April of last year, less than a year ago, but now, broadly speaking, could be characterized as being in its own recession. You say, Anirban, aren't you overstating things a bit? For instance, isn't it true that home sales prices, according to the most recent data, are higher now than they were a year ago, for instance. That if we were to look at the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index by metropolitan area, for instance, if you were to compare prices from, let's say, November of 2021 versus November of 2022, which is the last month for which we have these data, that home prices are up 18.4% in Miami, 16.9% in Tampa, so on and so forth. And yes, that's true. In almost all of these markets that make up this particular index, home prices are up on a year-over-year basis. Again, only through November because the data are lagged. But these are the most recent data from this index. Yes, that's true. But if you look at the last month of data, just last month for which we have data, which is November of 2022, the zero axis is on the right. Everything's negative. Prices are falling now. And what you have in the housing market is a bifurcation between what sellers want and what buyers want. Perhaps that's always true, but it's even more true now. So the prospective seller looks at the market and says, I wish I had sold this house back in January, February, March of 2022, when there were still bidding wars and mortgage rates were still very low and so on and so forth. Mortgage applications were high. I wish I had done that, but I didn't. My timing has been poor. I was a little late off the mark. And so, but here's the thing, I don't want to pay for my poor timing. So I'm going to keep my asking price high. After all, I only need one buyer to bail me out. That's all I need. Somebody just, loves this house for whatever reason and pays that price. I'm not lowering my asking price. The prospective buyer says, wait up, home prices are not falling? I don't want to catch a falling knife. I don't want to leave the settlement table and have negative equity right away. I'm going to bid low. So sellers up here, buyers down here. What you get in the short term, very few home sales. And this, of course, matters a lot to realtors as we approach the spring selling season. At some point, however, the inventory of unsold homes begins to build up. It's very low right now, admittedly, but it will start to build up, at least higher than it's been in the last couple of years. And increasingly, sellers will capitulate. They'll start to reduce their asking price. We've seen this in previous cycles. So if you go to Zillow.com, for instance, and look up towns like Sarasota, Florida, and Naples, Florida, towns for whatever reason I look up all the time. I don't know why. But the point is, if you do that, those asking prices are starting to come down. So it is a weaker housing market. And how does this also affect the economy in addition to the effect on realtors? Well, production, of course, of new housing units is one of a number of leading economic indicators I'll show you as I move toward the tail end of this presentation. You got to pull a permit before you build. U.S. residential building permits. The yellow line there, that's single-family permits. And you can see here that's collapsing. People are just not interested right now in purchasing a home. Now, the inventory is low, so you'd think that new home permitting would be higher, but mortgage rates have really collapsed that market, which is exactly what the Federal Reserve wanted to do. They've engineered this. And this, of course, will have a transmission effect across the economy, though that takes time. Now, the green line there is multifamily. That includes apartments and condominiums. But the data series is dominated by apartment construction, as it turns out, apartment permits. Now, I would expect that segment to hold up much better. For obvious reasons, all things being equal, higher mortgage rates are good for the apartment market, the rental market. If you can't buy a house or don't want to buy a house, you're going to rent. That pushes up occupancy and pushes upward pressure on rents. There is a restaurant chain known as Checkers. Are you familiar with this restaurant chain, Checkers? So their slogan is, you got to eat. You got to eat, which I viewed as the worst slogan in the history of American enterprise, because yes, you got to eat, but not at Checkers, right? You don't want to do that. That's a very bad option, as it turns out. But the same logic applies to the housing market. You got to have a place to live. That said, even in the multifamily market, you see some diminution of permitting activity. And why is that? I suspect it's because of the availability of financing. That the word on the street is that many significant money center banks, fearing that a recession is coming, have started to make the decision that they want less exposure to real estate. And we can already see rising delinquency, for instance, in the subprime auto lending market. So many Americans bought expensive used cars, very expensive, pricey used cars, and new cars too, I suppose, during the pandemic. Now they're having more difficulty paying that down. Savings rate is down, so on and so forth. Credit card balances are up. And so, do you want exposure to real estate in that kind of context? It will appear that money is starting to dry up. I won't name who those banks are, but the point is, when a Brian Moynihan, who's CEO at Bank of America, says, I think recession is coming, albeit perhaps just a mild one, that's a signal to his lending officers, maybe I need to dial things down a bit, be more cautious in my lending, demand more from the borrower, like a higher credit score. So money is becoming less available, and of course that would tend to affect real estate development and therefore permitting. Now, here's another leading indicator, but this one pertains more to commercial construction. This is the Architecture Billings Index. You see the 50-yard line running west across that slide? And by the way, I took great umbrage at the comments about the Baltimore Ravens during the introduction. That was very unkind, I thought. I know you felt awkward about that too, and so please bring that up with him afterwards. But you see the 50-yard line running west across that slide? Any reading below 50 means that architects are less busy this month than they were last month. Look, for many months during the pandemic period, architects were getting busier and busier and busier. As the leading indicator, the logic is very simple. If architects are busy upstream, contractors will be busier downstream, at least contractors that work on projects that involve architects, like office buildings, hotels, shopping centers, you name it. But during the last 3 months, you can see here the weight of this higher cost of capital and maybe tighter lending standards now starting to diminish design work. I was asked by a significant university recently to opine on the issue of whether or not they should wait to start some of their construction projects. That, of course, the cost of delivering construction services is very high right now. And the notion was, well, in the next 2 or 3 years, if we waited, will there be a window of opportunity for us to get more favorable bids? And I'll come back to that question in a moment, but if you look at this, if it is indeed the case that architectural design work, or design work generally, is declining now, then of course that would suggest more contractor capacity at some point in the future, just something to keep in mind. Now, one of the great things about economics is that you can tell any story you want to tell. If you want me to tell you the economy is terrible, I can go on Fox News and tell you the economy is terrible. I have no problem with that. You want me to tell you the economy is great? I can go on CNN and tell you the economy is great. There are enough data to support any story you want to tell. That's the point. And in fact, that's happening right on this one slide, this single slide. This is total non-residential construction spending, so everything other than apartments, homes, the things we live in. 2 lines here. They're both non-residential construction spending, but the line that ends at the top, that lighter green-colored line, that's in current dollars. That's in current dollars. That is not inflation adjusted. And you look at that line and say, my goodness, it's been a fabulous recovery in non-residential construction spending. Fantastic, though, you can see things are starting to slow down, interestingly. But fabulous recovery when you don't adjust for inflation. The economy is great. The non-residential construction economy has been great. The darker green-colored line, that's inflation adjusted. My goodness, what a sorry recovery. Not even reaching that pre-pandemic peak in real terms. And yet, you talk to almost any contractor, and they will say what? We are operating at capacity. We have more work than we know what to do with. How can that possibly be? Much of the growth in non-residential construction spending is because they're charging more for their services, not because they're providing more services. That's what this is saying. So if they're not providing more services, how can it possibly be that they're operating at capacity? Because the capacity of the industry has shrunk. And why has the capacity of the industry shrunk? Labor force. So, well, but they actually have more workers now than they did pre-pandemic, Anirban, so how is that right? Because the workers they have now are not as productive as the ones they had back then. Why is that? Because the workers they had back then, more of them were baby boomers, and those have retired in large numbers. The baby boomers, they brought their A game every day to the construction job site. They loved what they did. They were thankful for their jobs. The young people of today, they're not thankful for their jobs. They think they're doing you a favor when they show up to work. They're angry at you because you make them work. They want to make TikToks. They don't have time for this. People say to me all the time, Anirban, with all this new technology, shouldn't productivity be growing? So for instance, if you can order your meal off a QR code, so you don't have to have wait staff come and take your order, they just have to deliver the food, can't they serve more tables? Sure they can, but why would they? So we had this phenomenon last year called quiet quitting. What is that, quiet quitting? I think it's real. I'm going to do just enough to keep my job. And what's the likelihood you're going to fire me when there's 11 million available unfilled job openings? The unemployment rate is 3.4%, less than it was pre-pandemic. So with respect to this question of whether or not it makes sense to wait, that maybe more favorable bids are coming, I actually think because of the direction of the economy that in fact, for certain types of construction projects, there will be an opportunity to get more favorable bids. Not for work that looks infrastructure-like, because anytime you speak to a public works contractor or a contractor that specializes in infrastructure, they'll tell you, Anirban, we're going to be busy for the next 5 years, maybe 7. There's so much money to be spent on infrastructure. So if you have anything that relates to like an infrastructure-related project that would use the same kind of contractors that do road work, bridge work, water and sewer work, that kind of thing, might as well do it now, because it's not going to get cheaper, not in the near term. But if it's about building construction, I think what we're seeing from the Architecture Billings Index and some of these other indicators, that some of these construction segments are getting weaker. The office market because of the specter of remote work, of course, the hotel market because of business conducted via Zoom, and of course the retail market because of the increasing pervasiveness of e-commerce online shopping. Indeed, I can break down the categories of non-residential construction for you right here. This is non-residential construction spending by subsector, not adjusted for inflation, February of 2020 versus December of 2022, so roughly 3 years of data. At the very bottom is public safety. Set that aside. That's coming out of the pandemic, and we were getting ready for the pandemic in February of 2020, and so that spending is down. But above that, lodging. That's hotel room construction. We have enough hotel rooms in this country. We built a massive number of hotel rooms during the 5 years prior to the pandemic. And now business increasingly is conducted via Zoom. I'm glad we're here today, of course, in this beautiful hotel in this gorgeous city. But in many cases, these meetings transpire online. Above that, a few categories is office, another weeks. And remember, this is not just for inflation. So in real terms, these numbers are much, much worse. Now, office includes the construction of data centers. And I still see a flurry of construction of the other stuff, meaning data centers, fulfillment centers, those kinds of things, backbones of the e-commerce economy. But traditional office-based construction is down, and what I see in many metropolitan areas is that despite last year's furious economic rally, the rally of the last 2 years, that vacancy rates in many communities continue to rise in the office market. Why? Because lease renewals are coming up, and many of those lessees are saying, I don't need so much space. And this is not a temporary phenomenon. Now, at the very top, the best performing category, manufacturing. This reshoring or nearshoring story is absolutely real. America is bringing more supply chain back home. Part of this is because we have now industrial policy in this country. It starts really with the Trump administration, the insistence, for instance, on bringing steel and aluminum production back to this country, including for national defense and homeland security reasons. It continues under the Biden administration with computer chips, for instance. In August, he signs the Chips and Science Act, and we now have about $200 billion in chip manufacturing facilities in development. Some of that's already begun construction, Arizona, so on and so forth. So it's real, this reshoring story. And so you see an abundance of opportunity in that manufacturing category and more to come. Unfortunately, there's a constraint to nearshoring and reshoring, a major one in this country. We don't have the workforce. We don't have enough machinists and mechanics and welders and so on and so forth. It limits us. But that notwithstanding, we still see a lot of reshoring. The mantra of the 1980s of if you want to be a profit maximizer, you must be a cost minimizer, and therefore you must be in China. You must make it in China. Communist Party, want to protect my intellectual property, want a simpler supply chain, less complicated logistics, so on and so forth. I don't want to be in China if that Taiwan thing happens, so on and so forth. More production is coming back home, and you can see that in the construction data. Unfortunately, of course, and you've faced this as construction users, the cost of purchasing construction services is wildly expensive. Part of that is labor force, but there have been other factors as well, equipment shortages, for instance, and elevated materials prices. This is the Inputs to Construction Producer Price Index, and what it says is that over the past 12 months, materials used in construction are up 7.9%. Now, again, you can see evidence of peak inflation, that we're off that peak when prices were rising 25% year over year. Supply chains have improved, but still 7.9% is significant. And I can break this down for you categorically. So this is 12% change in these construction materials prices. So as an example, concrete product prices, and concrete, of course, is ubiquitous in construction, of 14.8% in 1 year, shortage of cement. There are some lingering supply chain issues. And typically, your concrete price will rise 2 to 3%. Now, 14.8%. It's a very awkward period, as it turns out, in American history, to be trying to rebuild our infrastructure. It's going to be hard for the taxpayer to receive good value for their dollars spent when delivering construction services has become so expensive, but that's where we are. You can see in some cases, in part because of weakness in the Chinese economy last year, the economy probably grew between 2 and 3% last year, that certain product prices like iron and steel product prices actually fell last year. But the Chinese economy is now reopening. The Chinese consumer has, like our consumer did during the early stages of our pandemic recovery, an abundance of savings. You will see Chinese tourists everywhere. You will see a real estate sector that will come back to life. Of course, that real estate sector, at least the residential part of it, has been in crisis. And that could speculatively bid up some of these input prices, like steel and oil. Indeed, oil prices up to $78 a barrel. Today, there are other factors like the earthquake in Syria, Turkey, so on and so forth, that are affecting that. So in any case, watch out, because I don't think materials prices will collapse, is what I'm trying to say. They're not going to rise the way they have, but the global economy, because of China in particular, stands to get a bit firmer as the year progresses. Okay, enough of that. Let's go to the forecast, and then we'll turn to Q&A. So this is not about you buying into my forecast, by the way. That's not what this is about. My goal this morning has been to try to issue spot on your behalf, so as construction users, you can establish your own forecast of the economy to the extent that you haven't already, and what that means for your enterprise, your stakeholders. Now, I mentioned leading indicators. Let me turn to a few of them. Again, I mentioned the primacy of the consumer in shaping economic outcomes. This is the University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment. Now, sentiment is not as bad as it had been several months ago because gasoline prices have fallen. So oil was at about $120 a barrel several months ago. Now it's at $78 a barrel in North America as of this morning. But the consumer is still pretty glum. I mean, similar to what they were feeling back in 08, 09 during the global financial crisis. What has got the consumer so downcast, so downbeat? Inflation. Inflation makes them angry. I don't know how many conversations you've had about eggs recently. My guess is more than a few. Everyone's talking about eggs. And not eating them, just buying them. People ask me all the time, why do Americans drive angry? Because they're angry. And you watch, CNN or Fox News all the time, you're going to be angry at somebody, somewhere. So there's that. And here's the thing. As I pointed out, retail sales have been slumping a little bit. And so what's happened, we've started to see some backup in inventories. And I think this indicator screams recession, screams it. You see the middle segment there? That's your retail inventories. Those are starting to back up. And you heard about the issues at Target and Walmart last year, but we see this spreading across the economy. And when the retailers see inventory backup, what do? They purchase less from the merchant wholesalers. You can see merchant wholesalers at the top there, that top segment. Their inventories have taken off. And so what do the merchant wholesalers do when their inventories back up? They start ordering less from the manufacturers. And indeed, in this country, industrial production is now falling. So a couple of the legs of the stool that suggest recession is here or coming are already actually in place. Retail sales are falling, industrial production is falling. And then there's this, the yield curve. People like to talk about yield curve inversion. Here I'm graphing two interest rates, graphing for you two interest rates. The 10-year Treasury yield, or interest rate in green, in gold is the 1 year. Now, typically you would expect the interest rate on a 10-year instrument to be above that relative to the interest rate on a 1-year instrument. Why? Because if I'm lending the government money for 10 years, I'm not going to get my principal back for 10 years. I'm going to demand more interest payment in the interim to reward my patience. But if I want to get my money back in 1 year, I don't need to charge so much interest. And I pretty much know, I know with certainty what my repayment, what my bond is going to be worth in a year. I'm going to get my principal back. But every once in a while, the market turns helter-skelter, topsy-turvy, upside down. And the yield on the 1 year goes above the yield on the 10-year, which is a way of saying that short-term money is very, very expensive. Now, the gray shade areas are periods of recession. So when the gold line goes above the green line, we have inversion. between the 1 year and the 10 year, which happened before the 1970 recession, before the 73, 74, 75 recession, before the 80 recession, before the 81, 82 recession, before the 1990, 1981 recession, before the 2001 recession, before the 07, 08, 09 recession, even before the 2020 recession, as it turns out, which is why some economists before the pandemic were predicting recession for 2020. They probably would have been wrong, but they turned out to be right because of the pandemic. And then now, where the yield on the 1 year today at 4.84% as I got up here is 118 basis points above the yield on the 10 year. Massive inversion and a fail-safe predictor of recession. So I think it's coming. Indeed, many economists agree that at a minimum, economic growth will be weak during the year ahead. Forecasts from 3 separate organizations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, OECD. The green color bars are 2023's forecast. The gold color bar is 2024. See the World Bank's forecast, 0.5%. Their forecast for the global economy is particularly dire, 1.7%, which if that were to pass would be the 3rd worst year in the last 30 years. Only 2009 and 2020 would be worse if that came to pass. And the forecast for the U.S. 0.5%. The International Monetary Fund is more optimistic, but they tend to be. So, now I have my own forecast, of course. Let me give you that. And my question is, can you handle the truth? Because maybe you can handle the truth. You say, Anirban, wait, sorry, I thought your theming was Tom Cruise. That's Jack Nicholson who said that in 1992, A Few Good Men, so you're off. Except that the young attorney who was asking Jack Nicholson the questions that elicited that statement, Lieutenant Daniel Caffey, was played by one young and, again, quite handsome Tom Cruise. It's going to get worse before it gets better. The global economy is weakening. The national economy is weakening. I've tried to provide evidence of that. Borrowing costs are higher. Excess inflation persists, which means more rate increases to come into a weakening economy. Now, again, the job market, very strong. I appreciate that. But economists often like to say employment is a lagging indicator. Now, I have to admit, I was surprised by the January jobs report. And indeed, many economists are suggesting that the chances of recession are receding. So the folks at Goldman Sachs said that the risk of recession is receding and that the risk of recession over the next 12 months is now down to 25%. Who are you going to believe? They're Goldman Sachs. I'm from Baltimore. But, I think what I think, and I will agree that some segments tend to hold up better than others, including public construction, grocery stores, and of course, multifamily housing. We talked about that. At some point, the Federal Reserve will stop raising rates. That will represent a key inflection point for the economy, of course. So the market's waiting for that. But I think we have to wait several more months, 3 more meetings for that to come. That's my prediction. And of course, you've got those lag effects. All those previous or prior rate increases continue to bend the economy downwards at a time when consumers have exhausted much of their savings. And so I think increasingly you will see recessionary conditions prevail. I think you're going to see some weak jobs report going forward, in part because the January jobs report was artificially strong. We'll see. That's my forecast. If you're interested in this kind of data analysis, I have a newsletter this year at sageecon.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not necessarily dying for dollars. If you're not interested, please feel free to pound sand. And with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. It has been a privilege. Let's go to Q&A. I've left about 23 minutes for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anirban. As you're probably noticing, we're going to do Q&A a little differently this morning than we had the last 2 days. You'll notice these folks with microphones. We're going to do a live Q&A session. And the reason for that is perhaps some of the questions are a little bit more complex or require context that would be hard to convey in your app. So the way we'll do it is if you have a question, lights are up, just simply raise your hand. One of these University of Cincinnati Bearcat students will take you the microphone, share your question, and then Anirban will answer. So who has the courage to ask the very first question? Right over here on the left. Thank you, Molly. Stand by for just a moment to get the microphone, and we'll get to the question.
Thanks. Well, thank you, first of all, for the presentation. It was excellent. A lot of the data seems to be taken up with retail, commercial, these kind of things. For some of us, we're very heavily in the industrial space. We're in a market that's driven by chip reshoring, bringing up the supply chain, EV battery, real major shifts in markets that are driving our business. Is there data available to get down to that level to understand what's really coming for us?
Yes, so the question is about the industrial segment And I mentioned, maybe only in passing, that this nearshoring story was real, that the mantra has changed, that more and more American CEOs want to bring that supply chain back to America, or at least North America. One of the things that's often ignored is that just before the pandemic, late 2019, 2020, the Congress passed the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, the new NAFTA, which among other things creates greater incentive for firms to put supply chain here to benefit from more favorable or the most favorable tariff treatment. And so that's what we have been seeing. This reshoring story starts around 2010, after the Great Recession, as deck chairs were moving then, but now even more so with the pandemic. So I think the demand for industrial, meaning heavy industrial space, will be extraordinarily high during the years ahead. Obviously, a lot of the space has to be available to withstand vibration, like the chip manufacturing segments, for instance, but as a general proposition, they have to be very clean, newish facilities, able to accommodate the most sophisticated equipment, whether robotics or whatever it happens to be. So I think there'll be a lot of new development of industrial facilities as well. And every economic development agency in the country, whether in Syracuse or Columbus or wherever, is looking to try to find more of the supply chain to come to their home. They want to rebuild this middle class, rebuild industrial capacity. There's another segment of industrial real estate, which is the warehouse and fulfillment center space. Often that's characterized by commercial realtors as also being industrial. The outlook for that is sketchier. And in particular because Amazon last year announced that they pretty much have enough warehouse space. And so that put a chill on that industrial, that portion of the industrial real estate market. But in terms of heavy industry, manufacturing, that story is real. More manufacturers coming here. There's no question in my mind about it. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, when I looked at your numbers and the inflation numbers, the energy sector seems to be way ahead of everybody. And I have to keep asking myself, is that real or is that just an opportunity?
Oh, good question. So the question is about what is driving these energy prices higher. And indeed, they've come off their peak. In fact, natural gas prices, I don't know if you've noticed, this morning we're at $2.49 per million BTU, quite low as it turns out. And recently in Europe, the price of natural gas fell below where it had been before Vladimir Putin launched his invasion on February 24th of last year. Quite remarkable how resilient free markets are. You have to love capitalism, because when there's a crisis, nothing responds faster than the free market, whether it's natural gas, whatever it happens to be. And so, oil price is $78 a barrel. If you look at the long-term trajectory of oil prices, that's actually not that high, as it turns out. True enough, it could be even lower. So one of the frustrating aspects of this period for me has been, unlike the manufacturing story, where I think eventually we're going to get massive increase in industrial production, the US oil producers have not invested significantly and not ramped up production very significantly. And you can actually see an utter lack of investment in refinery capacity. And it's one of the reasons that we have these issues, that oil prices can't be even lower. And you can understand why these oil companies like Chevron and others are doing this. They're making massive profits. Share prices have taken off because I'm sitting here, I'm producing what I'm producing, I'm not doing anything, I'm not investing more, I'm not buying more land, anything like that, I'm not hiring more workers, I'm not drilling more, but I'm just making more for what I'm producing. And then I'm sitting back, I'm CEO, I issue fat dividend checks to my shareholders, the board is happy, my compensation committee is happy, which means I'm happy, which means my family members are happy, everyone's happy, but except the American consumer. So, and part of this, of course, is this awkward transition between fossil fuels and alternative energy, and a source of consternation among many, which is, if I think the future is wind, solar, nuclear fusion, whatever it happens to be, why would I invest in fossil fuel generation or refineries today? That investment I need to pay off over 30, 40 years. In 30, 40 years, the technology will be very different, societal use. And so you're going to see these artificially elevated prices, not because of opportunism necessarily, just because we have this awkward transition, and that's just not going to go away anytime soon. Yes?
Yeah, do I remember correctly that it was just a few years ago that we were worried about deflation? And we'd had years and years of low interest rates that we just couldn't quite understand. And I'm curious, was there a pent-up effect that the reason we're having high inflation now is because we held it artificially low earlier?
Right. So the question is this about, you heard it about deflation, and you're right that in many advanced societies, including the United States, for instance, we had difficulty getting up to our 2% inflation target. We were having to stimulate the economy to get to that. And many factors involved. One is productivity growth. Of course, workers becoming more productive, the effect of technology, and so on and so forth. But also part of it was demographics. That we just are not seeing the population growth in the advanced worlds, and even in the emerging world. China actually lost population last year, that we used to. And so you've got all this productive capacity, you've got fewer people consuming, you're going to have deflationary tendencies. Japan is a perfect example of this. They've had deflation for 30, 40 years. Their population is falling. 150 million people a few years ago. 2050, I think their forecast is 127 million, according to the World Bank. So, yes. And so your question is, was this sort of, are we sort of reverting to the mean, I think is really your question. I don't think so. It took a lot to get to this situation. It took a Federal Reserve that was asleep at the wheel. So I can tell you, when inflation began to blossom in the spring of 2021, if Paul Volcker had been Federal Reserve Chairman, he would have stomped out immediately, as he did in the early 1980s. He was Federal Reserve Chairman from 79 to 87. Alan Greenspan, Federal Reserve Chairman, he would have stomped out immediately. He would have preempted it. You might remember Alan Greenspan was criticized wildly for starting to raise interest rates in 1994, even before inflation manifested itself. And by 1996, we were almost back in recession. He was so aggressive in terms of being an inflation fighter. And then Nobel Prize winner Ben Bernanke. If he had been Federal Reserve Chairman, this would not have happened. Now, I'm biased here. Those were three top-notch economists. Jerome Powell is an attorney at law. So I don't think he saw it. They didn't see it. And there are other things factoring into the thing. And it was a pandemic. So I think that really we didn't have to have this burst of inflation. This came out because of a combination of fiscal policy. Of course, if you watch Fox News, this whole inflation thing is due to President Biden's $1.9 trillion package, which is on March 11th of 2021, as it turns out. But we had a lot of fiscal stimulus before that still working its way through the economy. Set that aside. It's not reversion to the mean. We triggered this inflation through our policy response to the pandemic, and now we're trying to undo that policy making. Yes?
Over here, to the right.
Sure. Quick one. Last time you were up here, you talked a little bit about the war, or the disruption around the globe, shall we say, or the more angry drivers around the globe, maybe, is the way to look at it from your perspective. You made no comment today. Is there no impact from this, or what's your perspective?
No, obviously there's impact from geopolitics. Though again, when that invasion was launched on February 24th, you saw instantaneously oil prices rose to $120 a barrel, natural gas prices rose to almost $10 per million BTU. A lot of that is unwound. So despite the fact that, many people are no longer buying Russian natural gas or oil or so on and so forth, the Chinese are, but others aren't, the free world has found a way to make do. Europe avoided recession this winter. No one predicted that. So I didn't mention it as much because of that. In my mind, the principal black swan that's out there, obviously you've got this mutating virus out there, you've got all kinds of things, is China-Taiwan. And, it should not, as organizational leaders, it should not escape our notice that a prominent general recently suggested that we'd be at war with the Chinese by 2025. That recently the Americans reached an agreement with the Philippines to bulk up their presence at 4 military bases, those military bases about 200 miles from Taiwan. Very rapid response possible. And that's pretty scary. And that the Chinese Communist Party seems increasingly desperate and increasingly interwoven into the affairs of people. Whether it's whether or not they can go outside during a period of COVID, or freedoms in Hong Kong, or what's going to happen to Taiwan. So you put all that together, it's pretty scary stuff. But you cannot build such black swans. Black swans are low probability threats that if they were to occur are of such a large magnitude that they can alter the behavior of financial markets and broader economies. You can't build that into your baseline forecast as a problem. So I can't build into my forecast the use of a tactical nuclear weapon by Vladimir Putin as he loses his war in Ukraine. Right? I cannot build into my baseline forecast, nor can anyone, the possibility of an attack on Taiwan, this year, next year, whenever it's going to happen, if it ever happens. And the American response. That could be the major factor here. How do the Americans respond to that kind of invasion? Do they do nothing? Or do they move, the Sixth Fleet or whatever it is, into the Pacific Theater? I don't know. So that's the kind of issue that we're dealing with right now. But none of those black swans are built to my forecast. And I still predict recession.
With the continued hawkish tone of the Fed and the recent surprising jobs data, has your prior prediction of recession severity evolved, and how will this recession differ from previous ones?
That's a great question. It's an unfortunate one because I have to be honest in my answer. Your question was, has my prediction of recession evolved? Yes, it has, which I hate to say, because you want to be sure about your forecast, not change it. But I have to admit that from the perspective of about a year ago, as the Federal Reserve was about to embark on this rate tightening cycle, that I would have predicted for 2023 a deeper recession than I currently predict. And I would have to admit that the chance that we avoid recession altogether is higher than it would have been from my perspective a year ago. Because it's been really quite remarkable how well the economy has fared in the face of all these interest rate increases. You can see the housing market is weak, and yet, even with such a weak single-family housing market, 517,000 jobs added in January, 11 million available job openings. And you can see that many employers are scrambling for human capital. That's not just the data, that's actually happening in the economy, and that surprises me. So I think if we have a recession, it'll be quite mild, quite shallow. I don't expect anything very deep, but I think by the end of the year, we could be in the mid-4s in terms of unemployment, which is not high by historic standards, but certainly higher than the 3.4% we see today. So I hope that answers your question. I wish you had not asked it. Quite frankly.
Over here, to the right.
Anirban, media reports indicate that the Ravens and Lamar Jackson are about $100 million apart on a contract, and he's seeking a guaranteed contract. What are your thoughts on the use of the franchise tag and a guaranteed contract for Lamar Jackson?
Yeah, right. So I think it's a great question. I don't think the Ravens would be wise to give Lamar Jackson that contract, guaranteed money. He's a runner. He gets injured a lot. Last 2 seasons, he's been injured significantly. He's getting older now, and he doesn't show up when we need him to show up, which is at the end of the year and during playoffs. We had that #1 seed in 2019. We played Tennessee. We're at home. He loses 19-3. So a pox on his house. By the way, he negotiates his own deal. He's his own agent, along with his mother. Right? And a lot of these quarterbacks are getting guaranteed deals, but he's more fragile than these other quarterbacks. So I think the Ravens would make the Joe Flacco mistake by signing him to a long-term, guaranteed contract. That set us back for many years. That's my answer to the question. I know a lot of people love Lamar Jackson. I'm no longer one of them.
Right over here to the right also.
So as we see this tightened labor market in many different areas, it leads me to think more about technology and productivity and AI. What are your thoughts in at least the near 1 to 3 year time frame related to that?
Yeah, I see all this stuff about ChatGPT and all the artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. I don't know what to make of it. I keep hearing that it's going to revolutionize various industries like financial advisory services, for instance. What do I need a human being telling me how to formulate the optimal portfolio? I just have, ask the AI machine. It'll tell me in 15 seconds, 60-40 bond, stock, whatever it happens to be, I'll know, given my risk tolerances and all those kinds of things. So I don't know what to tell you. I find that when technology emerges, we're very slow as a population to adapt to it. We're here talking about construction today, for instance. And we have all these things, robotics and drones and so on and so forth. Doesn't the typical construction job site look just like it did like 50 years ago? Isn't there like a guy out there? And in fact, it's changed so little that often you will see the bulk of the workers are simply standing around for whatever reason. You notice in construction, they're just standing around. People are just standing. But one person's actually got a sign saying, "Men working." That's how much the industry has changed. Okay, and the issue is this: how do you adapt to new technologies, whether AI or robotics or whatever it happens to be, when your workforce can't handle the current technology? And that's why construction doesn't change. That's why many other industries don't change, because people aren't sophisticated enough to handle next technology. They're sophisticated enough, some people, to develop the new technology. But then how do you diffuse it across the population? Isn't it true that construction productivity is very low? But we've had all this innovation. We have now robots that can lay brick. They don't do corners well and so on and so forth, but they can do it. But how do you adapt to that? You don't, at least not very quickly. And so I'm skeptical that our life is going to change in the next 1 to 3 years over AI. Somebody's life will change. And somebody will become a billionaire because of this kind of whatever innovation. But do I expect my life to be different in 3 years because of AI? I do not. I don't.
One over on the left.
So earlier you mentioned there were 11 million jobs available in the U.S. Does that only include full-time, or is that part-time opportunities actually make it even worse than what we are currently seeing?
Right, no, that includes full-time and part-time. And indeed, if you look at the bulk of job creation recently, just look at the they were recently revised back, that in recent years, a bulk of the jobs created have been part-time. And that's what the workforce is looking for in many cases. They want that flexibility. I suspect that a lot of construction workers today are actually going to drive Uber and Lyft. Right, because now, not only do I not have to work outdoors, I'm indoors in my automobile or SUV, whatever it happens to be, but I turn on the app when I want, I turn it off when I want. And one of the things about these younger generations in particular, and one of the reasons I think they like part-time work, the flexibility, but they don't seem to care as much about money as older generations did. That the baby boomers really cared about money, right? My generation, Generation X, really cared about money. All my friends growing up, what did we want out of life? A 3 Series BMW. That's all we wanted, which I bought in 1997, Montreal Blue 328i. Setting that aside, which means I was a success. And that mattered to me. These young people, they strive for work-life balance. And what that tends to mean is less work, more life, which is, again, consistent with this notion that a lot of the jobs being created are part-time, and often not because the employer wants it to be a part-time job, because the employee, the prospective employee, says, I'm only going to work these many hours. You now have, at certain hotels, an app that allows hotel staff to tell them, including hotel maids, to tell the hotel when they intend to work that day, what hours. They determine that. And one of the big struggles that will happen going forward now, obviously you have the struggle over remote work and trying to get people back to the office or the job site, but one of the big movements over the next few years, the 4-day work week. And you're going to start to see more and more employers recruit and retain human capital by offering a 4-day work week. This is, that's even, in my mind, that's a part-time job. So, in any case, I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Question here.
So your construction spend by subsector showed almost a 60% increase in manufacturing, but I was surprised to see almost a 15% decrease in power. So is generation going to be able to keep up with manufacturing with them being such a heavy user?
Right. So you saw that decline in the non-residential category called power. And a lot of that, digging into data, is in fact refinery investment. The lack of investment in refineries is really driving a lot of that statistic. You're right. We are investing less in power generation, though you've got a couple of nuclear facilities under development and those kinds of things. But you're right, we haven't invested much in power generation, but a lot of it is the refinery capacity. That's where we see a real lack of investment, a lot of the bottlenecks forming. And some of these refineries that used to be open have now been shuttered, and they're not coming back to life. That's one of the reasons I think that you're not going to see very, very low gasoline prices ever again in the future, is we just don't have enough refinery capacity, or all kinds of other fuels. We just don't have that kind of refinery capacity anymore. So that's, I think, what's really driving that power segment, which is peculiar, right? Because you would think that during a period of pretty high energy prices, there'd be more investment in power. No, I think these CEOs are sitting back and saying, I'm going to issue dividends to my shareholders. I don't need to take more risk.
Al?
So 6 or 7 months ago, there was major concern about lack of natural gas in Europe, and many of the chemical plants would have to be shut down because they were worried about the freezing weather and so forth, and the need to supply the local populace, and then the plants would be shut down. And so there's also been a lot of discussion about Germany and some of the European countries where we're going to be borderline on crisis for lack of natural gas. Do you know what changed on that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, with respect to the low natural gas prices in Europe and elsewhere, as I said, this morning as I got up here, natural gas was at $2.49 per million BTU. That is dirt cheap. And this is the winter, by the way. I mean, we're in February. But of course, we've had a very mild winter in the advanced world, so that really allowed natural gas stockpiles to stay elevated. As often is the case, the true success rests with the Americans. So the Americans are the leading producer of natural gas in the world by far. I know a lot of people don't like fracking out there in the world, but the fact of the matter is that we have had a natural gas revolution in this country in terms of production. And at the same time, we've been producing so much natural gas that for many, many decades, we had liquefied natural gas terminals that allowed imports of natural gas. Now, increasingly, we are exporting natural gas, including to Europe. And one of the hubs of exports in my state, Maryland, is a liquefied natural gas terminal in Calvert County, Maryland. And we just export so much Marcellus shale developed natural gas, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, through that Maryland terminal to Europe now, but also to the Indians and many others, the Japanese. And so American ingenuity and productivity, though I complain about it a lot, at least productivity, is at the heart of why natural gas prices are much lower than they otherwise would have been, and why Vladimir Putin is so badly losing this war, because he's lost the European market. Who's gained the European market, by the way? Norwegians to a certain extent, I suppose, but it's the Americans. We have displaced the Russians in Europe in terms of natural gas production. We win. So Vladimir Putin loses, the Ukrainian people have suffered, but we win the economic war, I think, here, as it turns out, for better or for worse. So hopefully that explains everything, but that's why capitalism has once again produced outsized, or at least better results than expected.
Far left, Molly?
So I had a question around long-term skills in the marketplace, especially with the younger generations and how you're talking about the remote work. During the pandemic, a lot of us went home and worked remote. When we came back, I found that some of our newer employees did not have the skill sets they should have had after a year or two because they had been working remote and hadn't been trained the same. Do you see that causing any future economic slowdown with a lack of skills training?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, look, there's a lot that goes into productivity, right? So when people think about construction, they often think about being able to handle some piece of equipment or being able to work with some type of material, whether it's drywall or paint or whatever it happens to be, brick. But often in construction, what is the leading factor that determines whether or not a construction project will be successful or not? Whether it'll come in, on time and on budget, which rarely happens, but if it were to, it's a communication. And what I notice with a lot of younger people, they're not very good communicators. And how could you be when you're texting in emojis? How are you going to communicate precisely? So yes, I think work from home caused a lot of debilitating impacts on productivity. It can affect your willingness to show up at a job site, your consistency in showing up to a job site, your communication skills, your ability to work in teams, and of course, you're not mastering various skills like working with certain types of materials or equipment, so on and so forth. So yes, I think that is part of the issue. But I think much more it has to do with, you can tell I don't like young people very much. I used to. I used to like them a lot. Like 30 years ago, I liked them a lot. But now not so much. And anyway, I think remote work is part of it. And it's just too tempting for these young people to work remotely and have that kind of lifestyle and not show up to a job site in the first place, and therefore not have to invest in skills that at the job site. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. But yes, I think it's been part of the pathology of productivity in America, is that.
One comment there, and Anirban and I have not discussed it, but you'll notice that what he said was lacking were what used to be called soft skills. We talked about it yesterday. They have become mission-critical business skills, collaboration, communication, including others in the narrative. Some of the things that represent the new VUCA, if you will. Interesting observation. We both agree on that point. Is there a final question? We have time for one more. And if there are none, we do have one. Great, thank you.
Great.
Hey, thanks very much, Anirban. Really good. Hey, how do we take advantage of a weak recession?
How does one take advantage of a weak recession? So it's often said, never waste a good recession. So a number of things happen during recessions I think could be quite positive. Here's one. And actually, I think the tech sector is already in recession to a certain extent, and they're already doing it. We had this furious hiring during much of this pandemic period. And undoubtedly, as you're hiring massively, you're going to take on some bad hires. This is an opportunity to rethink the balance sheet, rethink the staffing model, and think about what assets or resources are needed as one moves forward into the recovery period and what is no longer needed. So what you get ultimately maybe is a more productive workforce on a per capita basis. by weeding out the worst performers. Many contractors, of course, have hired massively, and they will tell you they're hiring people who probably should not be on the job, including as jobs as foremen, for instance. You know, I heard a contractor say, we've got 3 or 4 foremen who probably should not be out there right now. But what are we going to do? We've got to get the job done. That's the kind of thing. And those are kinds of people who probably, if there's a recession, at least in privately financed construction, that you wouldn't want to bring those forward into the future, that kind of thing. It would also, I would presume, put some deflationary pressure on certain commodity prices, probably bring the cost of capital back down a bit, a recession, right? Demand for money goes down during recession, cost of capital goes down. So there's opportunities for refinancing, those kinds of things. So yes, I think there's some great opportunities if we in fact enter recession, even if it's just a mild one.
All right, let's show our appreciation one more time for Anirban. Thank you, sir.